So, Mark, before we begin, do you want to say a few words about yourself and what you do?
I am interested in general philosophy, particularly with ethics. A lot of people will know me from the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. Prior to this, I was just in a discussion on animal ethics and talking about the philosopher Steve Bess and his critique about pacifism. And then I've been thinking about how do we ground knowledge, and then I've been thinking about intergenerational ethics as well. So it's kind of like all over the place. I don't really have a set grounding of what I'm thinking about. I try to think. I just think about everything at once.
What is your ethical theory?
So I call myself like a quasi deontologist because I'm not too sure which one. But that's a vast difference than, so I think I was like a negative utilitarian for close to 7 years, maybe 8. Really? I can't remember. Yeah. I was a big proponent of it. And now it makes, now I've completely shifted my view. And I'm not too sure what is, whatever realm of ethics I go into, this seems to be like a real big point of contention depending on like how you approach ethics. And I don't think there's a winning of this debate. Like, I think this is just like, you can articulate your views and hopefully the person they haven't heard these critiques before and maybe they'll shift over. But I feel like in general, in just like the general realm of philosophy, this is like a battle that'll go on for a very long time. I forgot, what is your view again?
I would consider myself a utilitarian, but I think it's wise not to commit to any particular ethical theory because there's an advantage, right, of having
tactic advantage.
I think also philosophical advantage.
Okay. I mean, like, yeah, if you can make an argument that's theory neutral, that's awesome.
Exactly. Yeah. Because I think that's the thing is we have to recognize that these things aren't settled philosophically.
Right.
And so I like to approach antinatalism and other things from various perspectives.
Same. And I think it's actually intellectually honest because like people have certain views and frameworks for how they approach ethics, right? And so it's like, okay, well, you have a different view. I have a different view. I'll give you the multiple views and whatever framework you're working with, we can work towards all roads lead to antinatalism.
Yes, well, that's the hope. Yeah, exactly. So I guess it's a kind of I wouldn't even call it respect, but it's just recognizing that these are very difficult issues, right, in ethics. And although I'm inclined to accept some form of utilitarianism, I'm open to other kinds of arguments, right? Non-utilitarian arguments for antinatalism. And I'm going to use those if I think that they have force. If I think that, if they strike me as plausible. So I think there's a...
Okay. Can I pause you there? Because like that triggers me. when you say, I'll adopt this argument because it has force, is it force for who your interlocutor, or is it yourself? That's what I'm really trying to figure out. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Myself. I actually feel the force of these arguments, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay.
It's a kind of, it pulls me for a moment, and then I go back to utilitarianism. But, I guess the utilitarian in me says, if they work, use them.
This is the difference that I really, really dislike. Not that I dislike you. I meant, so when I got into animal ethics, I've heard that for years with activist circles. And my heart is in the technical details. And I actually feel like if I have to spend time, like I feel like in terms of like allocating my time, one could say you ought to give very general arguments and try to just convince as many people as possible.
Mm.
And for me, my heart is driven, my feels, all right, this is not analytic philosophy here, but I want to go into the meta physics and the meta ethics and the grounding of antinatalism. And I feel like a lot of antinatalism work can be propagated in multiple fields, like feminist literature, for example, feminist ethics, like antinatalism should be engaged heavily in that sphere. I think it will be eventually, and a few feminists have, like what's her name, Christine Overall, and there's a few others. But my point is that I'd like to see people that specialize in meta ethics and other fields engage with antinatalism on a very, very technical basis. Now, is that practical? Is that going to maximize the good? I don't know. But I think that we need what helps me sleep at night is the hope for a more solid theoretical grounding. I think that if I don't have a good theoretical grounding for my belief system, this is why, like, I have a surface level knowledge of meta ethics, but my hope is to read more on it and learn more about it. Like, what practicality is that going to have for my day-to-day life? Not much, but I'll feel more grounded in my my epistemology of how I've come to these conclusions. And if I can somehow articulate that to others, then that's an added bonus. Do you feel like you have that with antinatalism? Like, do you think that's do you think we're solid? Are we on solid ground?
Yeah, I think at least if we say something like, generally, it's wrong. I think, like, I think if we're going to say that it's always wrong, right, there's no conceivable circumstances.
Yeah, like, do you think that case can be made?
No, but might not be good for us to say that. And not because it will upset people, but because
why would it
I don't even think, what I mean is, I'm going back to Sidgwick's view about how some things, I mean, I like the case, I like using torture. That's a common example, the example that's often used. So torture is wrong. Is it always wrong? Like, is there, you know, can we not even imagine a case where torture will be the right thing to do? Well, I think we can, right? I mean, but a utilitarian might indeed say, don't even talk about it. Because once you start, for example, would I say that, so obviously I'm saying there are cases, right? There may be, you can at least imagine, certainly, situations where torture will be the right thing to do. But would it be right to go on Twitter and say that there are situations in which torture is what you ought to do?
So you do have some hesitancy, right, for certain topics. And I guess what I'm curious about is those topics. But the thing is, if you tell me those topics, then they're out there now. So a little of a paradox there.
Yeah, this was the paradox of the esoteric stuff. Because you shouldn't even talk about esoteric morality, actually. But there are some things, like views about, and for example, even stating that there are exceptions to antinatalism, right? That it is not, at least for me, it's not an absolute, kind of absolutist view where it's never permissible. Many people have said stuff like that. You know, I
was just going to say, like, doesn't that make it less of a harder pill to swallow for people? Wouldn't it be like,
right?
So like when I think about vegan advocacy, I feel like when I give like all or nothing kind of attitude, people are less likely to engage with that. But if I'm saying, you can slowly take steps to model your life in a way that will not engage in the unnecessary exploitation of animals. Now you can't, and practically speaking, like every vegan will technically cause some suffering to animals, right? It's not like 100% absolute cruelty-free lifestyle. Just living here is going to cause harm. But now when you are honest about that there's a spectrum of harm, and that what you want to do is just minimize the amount of harm, and it's not like 100% pure. I don't know, that to me seems like an easier pill to swallow than an absolutist position. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that is actually, well, I'm now thinking true for antinatalism as well. Maybe it is good to concede that actually, it's not that strong a view. We're not saying that it's, can't even imagine circumstances in which it would be miserable. And sometimes I do think holding a more modest view like that does seem to bring more people in with some things. And I think you're right about with veganism, it's important to be clear that, we're not saying that there's no harm if you're vegan. So, and just acknowledging that, I think, does make the view more credible, maybe. And I wonder if something like that might be true for antinatalism as well, because when we talk about antinatalism, I'm very reluctant, honestly, to say that there are exceptions. I don't really.
I feel like if I say that, I'd really have to qualify that right away, because it can go into dangerous territory in terms of because there's a lot of negative association with like crypto-fascists or what's it called, eugenics, and I don't know what else.
Oh, right.
Eco-fascism, stuff like that. So if you're like, well, there's some exceptions, and it's like, oh, only the wealthy, privileged can, like, I feel like some people's brains can go that way. And I mean, I have seen people that say those things. So yeah. When you say exceptions, those are not the exceptions you're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
Because like for me, I'm like, okay, a transhumanist utopia would be an exception. But the probability of that happening, I mean, honestly, I think I commend the cause. Do I think it'll come about? I mean, I hope it does, but I just don't see it happening anytime soon. That's all.
It's really it is kind of a fine line, though, right? Because there are some things, I think, that while true, are better to just not state. So, for example, like with veganism, sometimes, okay, so people divide on this, but assuming that, say, 5 pounds are not sentient beings, right? Okay, that's a reasonable assumption, I think,
right?
Given what we know, would I, like, suppose I'm doing vegan activism, am I gonna really say to people? Some people say that eating oysters is okay. I just think that there is a fear that people will take that and just say, okay, then maybe eating shrimp is also okay, and like it's like, so I think there are some things I'm very reluctant to say, because I actually think that it will weaken people's commitment.
So I disagree with you on this. I think that, well, because like I've held both views. At first I was like, I agree with you. Like I've had the exact same position, but then intellectually I'm like, it's dumb to be saying, yeah, don't harm non-sentient things. So I'm like, well, why am I saying that? Because when I articulate animal ethics and I'm saying that sentience is important to this ethic,
right,
then I need to show that, when it comes to organisms on this earth, that some of them are sentient, some of them are not. Now the confidence of some of these creatures, varies, and we're still getting in new information, And wherever we draw the line, draw it with a pencil, right? But I feel like if you're more honest that way, then people, because the bivalve thing, that like, even I feel like when I was not vegan, that was one of my retorts. I was like, well, what about this? What about insects?
really?
What about parasites? What about, and the thing is, a lot of people bite those bullets. They're like, yeah, don't hurt the oysters. And I'm like, what evidence do you have that they're sentient? And they're not showing me anything. And I'm like, well, why do you want me to take this position on having moral consideration for non-human animals that are sentient, and at the same time contradict yourself by saying, care about these sponges?
It's interesting to hear you talk about that you had those questions for people, because it's always good to know, I guess, how people, come to these views. And this sort
the problem with that is that people come to these things like differently, right?
Yeah.
So that's another problem. It's like, well, what works for me will not work for you, will not work for someone else. And yeah, it's confusing.
Do you remember how you arrived at antinatalism? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was through veganism. So I was really upset about this because one thing was, we would always, after doing activism, we would always say, we saved these amount of animals today. And I'm like, wait a minute, we didn't save anybody. I didn't say that out loud to the group, but I would think about it. And I'd go home and I'm like, what animals did I save? I spared them coming into existence, assuming people adopt this position. I think to save an animal, like, that entails that the animal currently exists, and that the only way to do that would be like direct action. You rescue an animal. And that small nuance bothered me for weeks. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that I'm arguing for non-existence for sentient life. And then my brain was like, well, why do I discriminate for humans? I'm like, why am I'm spending so many hours that these animals shouldn't come into existence? And then I'm like, well, humans hurt, humans suffer. They shouldn't come here either. And yeah, so then I became an antinatalist. And to me, the connection is very clear. Like, when people say they don't understand the connection, I'm like, I don't understand. You don't understand it.
So it was really a step to antinatalism for you. I mean, obviously,
to me, it is antinatalism. The main principle is that not creating into existence is a moral good. All I did was take it to it. I applied it to all species, sentient species, right? Like sentient creatures. To me, I feel like I was already an antinatalist. I was just, people didn't call vegan ethics an antinatalist position. I think it's a species specific antinatalist position. It's specific to certain species, but usually farmed animals, right?
Right.
This seems to be quite a contentious thing in antinatalist spheres, and I'm surprised by that. What do you think about that?
I guess it doesn't surprise me, but it is. I think it's. Yeah.
Okay. Why doesn't it surprise you? Like, I would love to understand it.
Because I think people are speciesists.
Okay. Well. Okay. Yeah. Okay. But okay, let's say, I'm talking to a speciesist, and I just don't understand, like, if you're a species, like, why can't you at least see the connection? Like, a lot of people say there is no connection. This is just an anthropocentric point of view. And I'm like, these other beings suffer. Like, now you can disagree on the obligations we have to them, fine. But can you just not, like, admit that, hey, if I'm making at least a position where coming into existence is a harm, might be a harm for other things that suffer too.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward to me, but to be honest, I was surprised how many antinatalists were vegan. I don't know if you had the same experience, but
the people that I talked, so the majority of antinatalists that I talked to are vegan. However, there have been polls done in the groups and the Reddit where the majority are not vegan.
Really?
And that surprised the heck out of me. And I think Life Sucks may have made a video in one. It was like a snippet in one of his videos, and he was surprised too. So yeah, like if you look at Reddit and you look at some of the Facebook groups, and I don't know if there's Twitter polls. Now the sample, might be problematic, but I think that, again, like my perception is dependent on my environment. So when I got into antinatalism, met a lot of vegans. I'm like, wow, a lot of antinatalists are vegans. Then I saw those polls and I'm like, oh, vegans are the minority. And then I had people be very adamant that no, antinatalism is anthropocentric. And then a lot of people are saying, no, it's sentiocentric. And I'm like, why are we all confused right now? I was curious, did you have comments on Ephilism, or did you?
I think really what Ethilists really care about is suffering. If it's suffering, there are lots of ways to, get rid of. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is Ephilism isn't, I don't see Ephilism as a view about how to get rid of suffering. I think it's just a view that says suffering is the problem. And
it's like a diagnosis.
Yeah, that's how I see it. I think it's just saying suffering is bad, and we should basically minimize it. And if obviously,
well, there's the prescription, right?
Right. Yeah. Yes. We should. Yeah, we should minimize it. I mean, I think Ephilism is more than just a moral view. I mean, it's a view about.
Yeah, it's making like a descriptive claim of like the ontology of the way things are.
Yeah, I mean, it's for example, like if you reject the theory of evolution, I don't think Ephilis will call you an Ephilis.
Right.
So it's not simply a moral view, it has other dimensions. So
I mean, maybe they would. I find it very difficult to speak on their behalf, but
yeah, I mean, but as far as what it recommends, right, what it prescribes, I think it basically coincides with a negative utilitarian view.
The thing is, I think so, but the reason why I'm hesitant to make strong claims about Ephilism is that when people do make strong claims about Ephilism, I feel like someone in the Ephilist sphere are like, no, that's not it. And I feel like this changing of views just makes it harder to even say what it is. So I could potentially see someone say, no, suffering isn't the only thing that matters. We should eliminate any possibility of life arising, period. So yeah, you could eliminate all sentience, but then the very possibility of sentience being created again through natural processes, you have to destroy the whole thing, like not just the life on the rock itself. And I feel like I've heard someone say that type of rhetoric before. I could be wrong, but again, like I could see a case being made for that.
Well, but still, even those who say that we should destroy the planet itself, I would think they don't think that there's anything intrinsically evil or bad about just a planet existing, right? I mean, in other words,
I'd be skeptical of that. I think like it's the process, like they're against DNA, right? Like I feel like they're against processes of things that can bring about things that ouch, or things that suffer.
But surely if there was no possibility of that, and I know, and I realize that that's not, but if there's no possibility that life will arise or whatever on some planet, I don't see why any ethicist should be concerned about that.
Well,
Yeah.
okay, so like I guess the condition is that getting rid of all sentient life, but you're still allowing non-sentient life.
Yeah,
Right?
and I think, if
There
we
are
just,
organisms that are not, that they're alive, but they're, well, I don't know if that's an appropriate term to call them, but like there's organisms that are not sentient. Let me put it that way. I think they would be concerned about those organisms.
yeah, they'd be concerned. It's not that there's something intrinsically bad about those organisms being there, but they could lead to trouble.
I was just going to say it's not just saying like there's also the obligation to bring about.
Yeah.
But
in that sense, it really is basically negative utilitarianism. And just to go back to that for a second, like your main issue with utilitarianism is that it says that things like lying are not intrinsically wrong.
There's multiple art, so like that's one of them. But using people as a means to an end is not. I don't think that's kosher. I think that the idea of doing more moral calculus without understanding, without being able to predict the future accurately is difficult when you can change the dials so easily. I don't think it's guiding me when I say, well, if this case happens, then I ought to do this. And it's like, well, I don't know for sure what other factors are going to play into an outcome. And then why am I outcome dependent anyway? So for an example, other cultures have different views about what would be good, for example. So think about, I think is it in Norse mythology or like the Vikings or whatever, like for their greatest glory is, and again, I might be wrong on the details, but it's like dying in battle and then going to Valhalla, right? Now that's not the heaven that I was presented as a kid, right? That sounds terrible to me, but that's what they think is good. And I'm like, okay, well, I have a bias for a heaven with a God that, I'll forever glorify. And then as I became an atheist, I'm like, wait a minute, that sounds terrible now. I feel like I'm in a dictatorship and I'm always going to be like, I know that the majority of Earth will be not there and I'm going to be sad about that. And the majority of my loved ones won't be there. So it just seemed like another hell. And there's like, if you dishonor yourself at war, like some people would rather kill themselves, right? That's not producing the more good. But there's a higher value there. There's something that they value, and I think that our values are very culturally informed. And I think there's cases where if I don't know the outcome, I ought to still do something. So for example, if you ask me right now, like, do I think a vegan world will actually come about? No, I don't. I'm very pessimistic. I think the world's going to I think we're in a state of like palliative care before we all just, things get worse. But I should still stand up for what I think is right, regardless of what I think can actually happen and come about. So let's say the Nazis win. Would I still try and stand up for, persecution of Jews, even though I could get shot and they win anyway? I think I should still do what I would be morally, why I think that would be right. Would I, I just feel like these principles have more sway to me than how many people I can, that could survive, or And a case I'm thinking of is like, would I abandon a child? Or like, let's say I have two, I think this was like Sophie's Choice. Do you remember that film?
I remember you mentioning it, but you'd have to remind me.
It's been I have to remind myself too. I think the scenario was like, you had to choose between your two kids of which one was going to live and die, and you'd have to like abandon one of your kids. And then someone told me, they're like, well, what about the other option where you stay and you don't abandon any of them and you all die? And I'm like, wait, that sounds terrible. But then I thought about it. I'm like, well, wait a minute, maybe that
Right.
isn't that bad. Maybe there's some virtue in that. And that like all these questions dismantled my utilitarian view, because I find it very difficult to talk about rights and justice and like all these rules. I get there's rule utilitarianism, but it seems like, say, a Rawlsian analysis or any contemporary view that's not utilitarian can hold just as much grounding for just like I'm just like justice and rights and ethics, and it just seems more, I don't know, it just seems to make sense to me now. But again, I'm applying my intuition, right? So like I'm on shaky ground.
Yeah, you mentioned the problem with treating others
As means to an end.
Yeah, merely as a means. One thing that Parfit argues, essentially, I think what Parfit says is this: you don't treat others merely as a means if you treat them only in ways to which they could rationally consent. So if somebody could rationally consent to something, then treating them in that way is not treating them merely as a means, right? Because your actions are governed by some moral constraint, basically. Okay, so Parfit says, but basically, this is my understanding anyway. We can rationally consent to being sacrificed to save, like sacrifice to save 5 lives, say. That seems reasonable. It seems like we could rationally consent to that. Then it seems like basically sacrificing you, right, to save the 5 lives is not treating you merely as a means, because we're treating you in a way to which you could rationally consent. I don't know if you.
I think that's clever. I think that's my initial response is that you don't know the person's framework of what they would choose. Maybe they're a care ethicist. Maybe they're a virtue ethicist. Why would I project onto them what they would choose?
Isn't that just imposing our own conception or whatever, rationality? Well, suppose we say, okay, you can only treat others in ways to which they would actually agree, like in ways to which they actually agree. The problem with that is, it seems like then you can't even justify saving someone's life by sacrificing someone's toe or something, right? Because people might not actually agree to that. I think what the argument is basically, that's implausible. We don't want to say that we can only treat others in ways to which they would actually consent, given their preferences or whatever. We want to import some kind of notion or conception of rationality and say, no, we can treat others in ways so long as they can rationally agree to it. And I agree that that's, there could be disagreement about what one could rationally agree to, but it seems to me like we could rationally agree to sacrificing our life to save 5 lives. I think it's a very interesting point, but
it is an interesting point. I will definitely give it consideration.
As far as like the lying obviously my view is that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with lying. The standard kind of utilitarian thing is, well, lying tends to lead to bad outcomes, and so yes, there's a rule that's useful, but
It's a useful rule, yeah.
to just say, okay, don't lie. Do you remember the desert island promise? I think it's
no. You're ringing a bell, but I don't remember this. No.
So you have a friend and they say, here's all this money, and I want you to, when I die, I want you to donate it to the, I don't know, what's it? Imagine something that you don't really think is that important. If you could donate that money to some cause that will save, say, hundreds of lives, right? Or you could donate it to some very trivial matter, like something that is going to do almost no good. Nevertheless, it's what they wanted, right? And it was their money. In that example, would you have no objections to that person giving all that money to? And again, right? There's no bad example being. No one is going to know about this.
I believe I think this is a contentious issue in the philosophy of death as well. Can the dead be harmed?
Right.
And there are arguments for that. It is one of my interests, and I hope to make a video on it because a lot of people ask me this question because I do hold that it's kind of like the deprivationist view, right? Where, okay, well, there's no subject, then how did you get harmed or how are you deprived? I think similar arguments can be made for being harmed after as well. You don't have to have that state to have your for those things to happen to you. Yeah, no, I would respect the person's will within certain, there might be exceptions to that.
Wait, but what would you think the right? I mean, what would be the right thing to do in that situation for you? I mean,
to donate to the trivial thing.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then, yeah, we definitely differ.
Yeah. So when I have property, like I have property right now, right? And you don't have rights to those property. But as soon as I die, you can take everything and just do what you want with it. Is that your case? Like, what if it was the money was to go to my my relatives, and you're like, well, that's just going to save one person. Screw it. Let's go save. Go save 5 other people. And then you just, you deprived my loved one of, and you disrespected my wishes. And interpersonally, do you know how that messes me up with friendships? Like, let's say I do die. I mean, eventually I will die. I mean, if you hold that view, I'm not going to tell you to like take care of my will. Is this one of the information hazards you shouldn't have said?
Well, what if we ramp up the, like, what if, is there no number of lives you could save that would cause you to change your view on that?
Potentially, but I'd have to understand how am I determining that threshold?
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah. So you do kind of work with thresholds?
Potentially. I need to know an argument for it. I'm like, okay, well, okay, we could hypothetically say there's a threshold, but what is that threshold? And I have no idea.
Okay. Because it does seem, it just seems difficult to accept that the consequences can never override deontological constraints. That seems like a difficult view to.
That does sound very challenging. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And I think like intuitively, I do have thresholds. But again, you asked me about like some of the my theoretical positions that I find like, I think like how the heck do I find that threshold is
Right.
something difficult to figure out.
Yeah, now I'm thinking that there are people who say that just numbers don't matter. Like if you're gonna say A or B, C, and D, you should be indifferent. And I used to hold that view. Do you think that numbers matters?
I think so, yeah. I don't hold strong to this view because I know the arguments in favor of it as well. So I'm not too.
Hmm. There was a
What made you change?
Yeah. So I used to think that numbers really doesn't matter. So if you have to torture person A over here, or you torture all these other individuals over here, the thing that kind of I found convincing is just the simple thought that no one experiences the sum of that pain, right? We can give it a number, but there's no individual who actually is going to feel that sum, the total. So it seemed to me like, well, maybe it's actually the same, even though that's also counter. That's
Oh,
very
is this
counter.
like the criticism of like the aggregate?
Yeah, yeah. And so for a while, pretty long time, I guess I was satisfied with that. I don't know if you had a chance to read Jonathan Glover's book. It's called Causing Death and Saving Lives.
Causing death and saving lives, yeah.
There is a philosopher to whom basically Glover's responding, and they say that okay, if you have two rocks, and you have A, and then on the other rock you have B and C. If numbers doesn't matter at all, you should be indifferent. You could go and save, and suppose you can only go to one rock. Okay, well, you should be indifferent according to this view that says numbers doesn't matter. But then Glover says, okay, but now imagine this. On Monday, right, there's A on one of the rocks and then B on the other. And then we all agree that you don't know anything about the identities of these people. You should be indifferent here. Okay, you just save one of them. But then the next day, C is on a rock, and the other rock there's no one on that rock. And we all think that you should just go and save C, right? No one thinks that you should just do nothing. Basically, what Glover says is those who think that we have no reason to save B and C together, right? It seems to imply this strange view that we think it's more important to save lives consecutively than to save them simultaneously. But I think the biggest thing is this. While it's true that no one experiences, like to go back to the example of agony, no one's going to experience the sum, that big number, right? But it's also true for individual moments in one's life. So it's not, we
That's
all
true.
want less suffering. But if these episodes of pain are spread out, it's not like we ever experience the sum of that either. So I
Right.
started to think about that, and maybe the distinction between moments in our life is relevantly like distinction between individuals. And if that's the case, then the distinctness, I guess, of individuals is not actually so important. To be honest, I'm not, it's not a view that I have that I'm strongly committed to.
Well, thanks for articulating. That's yeah, it gives me some food for thought. I'll have to think about that.
Do you like paradoxes, by the way?
Zeno's paradox.
Things like that? Like
Yeah, they're fun.
Oh, really? Okay. Do you know the surprise test paradox?
No.
Oh, you might like it. Okay, so a teacher says, we're going to have a surprise test next week. It's going to be between Monday and Friday, one of those days. That seems fine, right? But
Yeah.
the students start to think through the possibilities. And
So one of them, or not what, it doesn't matter. They think, okay, can the surprise test be on Friday? In other words, can the surprise test be given on the last possible day it can be given? Seems like no, right?
Right.
Right. Like, how can you, because once it's Thursday night, they're all going to be preparing for that test.
Right.
Okay. So it seems like Friday, it's not going to be on Friday. So they can rule out Friday. It's not possible to give a surprise test on the last possible day. But since we've now ruled out Friday, once it's Wednesday night, it's got to be Thursday. Right. Because it can't be on Friday. So now it has to be on Thursday. So that means you can't have it on Thursday either.
Oh.
And by the same, reasoning, you can basically rule out every day of the week. And so the paradox, of course, is that on the one hand, it seems perfectly possible for the teacher to announce this surprise test and give it. On the other hand, it seems like it's not possible.
I love that. I like that.
There's a paradox involving threats. Hypothetically, let's say I have a child, right?
Yeah.
You have kidnapped my child.
Did you adopt or create this child?
I adopted this child.
Okay.
Okay, so you've kidnapped my child.
All right.
And you are going to torture this child, right? And I get a call from you, basically saying that you're going to torture my child. Obviously, I want to stop that, right?
Right.
The problem is the only way, like let's suppose the only way I can stop you from doing this is to threaten to torture your child.
Oh.
You love this child. This is the only thing I can say to you for you to stop, to not torture my child. However, no, sorry, you're going to torture and kill my child. Okay. Okay. So I say, if you do that, I will torture and kill your child. Okay.
Okay. An eye for an eye.
Yep. Wonderful. Ethics. But okay, so you say, but here's the thing. You are very good at reading people's voices, right? You know when somebody is just
bluffing
saying things. Okay. So I'm totally transparent. In other words, I have to actually form the intention of really seriously torturing your child and killing that child if you were to do that. But, okay, but notice this. It seems like the right thing for me to do then is to form that intention, to really intend to do that, right? Because otherwise you'll read through my whatever. Okay, but the problem is, or the paradox kind of is this. It's wrong though, right? To torture your child after that child is already dead, after you've killed my child. Like, how could that be good? How could that be the right thing to do, to torture and kill your child after it's already done, if that makes sense? That is totally unjustified, right? Like, even
like after I killed your
exactly. So what that shows, it seems, is, see, normally we think that the right action is that which a morally, a good person would do, basically. But in these cases, it seems like you have to be somebody who isn't good in order to do the right thing. Because how can you be a good person and form, and intend to do something that's clearly.
Is this like a criticism of virtue ethics? Because like, doesn't the outcome
Sorry, I'm not sure. I think it's just like one of these. The context was nuclear deterrence, I think. And yeah,
gotcha.
Yeah. I don't know. So that's another one that I kind of think about sometimes.
I see. So this might be wrong, but when I've started to engage in philosophy, and I have a friend who started reading like an intro to philosophy course. She's interested in psychology as well. And she's like, yeah, every time I engage with a question or I see this answer, like it opens up new areas, like new questions. But it feels like a branch from a tree, but the tree's still going in a direction.
Right.
So like there's a lot of branches opening up the more you ask questions and stuff like that, but there's still a direction there and there's still growth there.
Yeah.
I sort of see it that way.
Yeah, and if nothing else, I mean, I think philosophers have really clarified.
The arguments are so precise.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
And that's always good for both sides, right? Because obviously to criticize some view, you have to know what it is.
Yeah.
So
do you get that sense from Hegel?
Oh, from Hegel. There was a book written about philosophical style. And the author of that says something like, when a person dies, right? When someone dies, somebody like, who was it? Maybe, I don't know, Jonathan Swift or something, will say, okay, you know, that they died or something, right? Kant would say, or Kant might say, their mortal existence achieved its termination. And Hegel would say, a finite determination of infinity had been further determined by its own negation.
That's awesome. Yeah. But okay, so like, I think one of the draws is that it sounds very poetic. And analytic philosophy is not very poetic. Like I try to find quotes from Benatar that could like really inspire, and I'm like, man, it is rare to find that. Like it doesn't have the same gusto as like some of the like continental old philosophy.
What time is it?
Yeah, it's like 2:42 a.m.
Well, this was good for me. I don't know if
Oh, I'm glad. Because I worry, you know, like again, like the points of reference and trying to articulate my views and trying to figure out like some of the details. I wish I could give more points of reference. But I'm glad that you got something out of it. I always get something out of chatting with you. So yeah, always enjoy these conversations.